Welcome to the Supported Living Property Podcast with your host, me, Lisa Brown, the place to learn about supported living property investing. Hi Ashley, it's great to have you here today. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm very well indeed, Lisa, and thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to talk.
It's great to have you here, Ashley. For those who don't know you, do you want to introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about you?
Sure. So my name's Ashley Horsey. I'm the chief executive of an organisation called Commonweal Housing. We're an independent housing-based social justice charity using the charitable funds that are available to us to identify areas of social injustice where housing is either playing a role in creating that injustice, but far more interestingly and far more importantly, where housing has a role to play to help people overcome those injustices and to move on with their lives.
So really important stuff, and I follow what you guys do at Commonweal very closely because there's lots of really interesting stuff that you're up to.
Well,
and your background's in housing as well, isn't it, Ashley? You've done a range of different roles, haven't you?
I certainly have. So I've been in and around this space for the last 30 plus years. Mainly in the housing association sector, but also predominantly working with those new innovations, those new interventions in the market where housing associations have been working with private landlords, increasing the supply of accommodation that's available for those in need at the time, predominantly homelessness and temporary accommodation, but others in housing need as well. So I first did private sector leasing schemes, as they were called back in the days. I started my first one in South London back in 1989, and then travelled from there to Oxford, ran a very successful scheme in Oxford for a number of years, and then over the intervening period I've had a range of different roles involving central government, heading up campaigning charities. And before I joined Commonweal, I helped to set up a new housing association called Local Space over in East London, working with the London Borough of Newham at the time, which was a 1,000 property buy-to-rent vehicle. So it was helping Newham to meet their need for temporary accommodation for homeless households. And we went out and acquired 1,000 properties over a 2-year period across East London to give that local authority greater certainty, greater security, better quality of temporary accommodation for them to use.
Fantastic. Such a depth of experience in all different parts of it. So it's really great to have you here today. What we wanted to talk about obviously was exempt accommodation. And that's a term that's thrown around quite a lot. And I think there's a bit of confusion about what it actually means. What do you think exempt accommodation means? What would be your definition of it, Ashley?
Okay, so we tend to describe it as it's an exemption from the housing benefit rules, which was introduced in 1996, which means that for those landlords who are offering something more than minimal care, support or supervision to the people living in their houses, that they can be exempted from the usual caps and limits on housing benefit, the local housing allowance level as it is now, and can actually receive a higher level of rent in recognition for the additional support and services that they're providing to the people living in that accommodation.
And that's really important for people who've got support needs who can't maybe fit into mainstream accommodation around, that would be funded by LHA or Universal Credit. But there are lots of issues around that, aren't there? And I know that this is something that you guys talk about a lot at Commonweal. What are those issues as you see them?
So from Commonweal's perspective, this matter was first brought to our attention about 4 or 5 years ago now, initially by Professor David Mullins from the University of Birmingham and his fantastic research associate Thea Raisbeck, who'd been doing some work on behalf of Birmingham City Council looking at the issues here. And the concern that they were starting to identify that Commonweal were shocked to hear about and to have absolutely been championing and raising the profile of over the intervening period is this subsector of exempt accommodation, which is often referred to as non-commissioned. exempt accommodation. So this is often short-term transitional housing that's developed over recent years, in particular, designed initially, one would hope, to provide transitional short-term support for people coming out of difficult transitional periods of their lives. So this could be people coming off of rough sleeping, history of rough sleeping, leaving the street for the first time, coming out of homeless hostels, but increasingly also about those that are leaving the criminal justice system, that are exiting prison, that are coming out of drug and alcohol rehab services, that are fleeing domestic violence in many cases, and a whole range of other issues that people are facing in their lives. And what's happening is people are going through, they're either coming out of prison, they're leaving those residential drug and alcohol services, and there isn't long-term secure housing available for them at that point of need. And because they're coming out of institutions, or they're still addressing other issues in their lives, they still require a little bit of support, supervision, care and support, as a sort of a step down process. And that there's not enough accommodation for long-term housing. And so a number of providers identified this as something that was important, and started to provide that accommodation for those individuals, and have made that available. And because they are providing this more than minimal care, support and supervision, are able to secure very high levels of rent. The social injustices that have emerged from that is it's an area of very limited oversight and governance and regulation by those powers that be, that really should be looking at this to control the quality of the accommodation, the quality of the housing, of the services being provided. And importantly, one of the things that Thea Raisbeck identified, particularly in the report that she produced with funding from Commonweal, Exempt from Responsibility, published in November 2019, was that very often you'll have a very, what she described as a risky mix of individuals within individual houses. So if you are a woman who is fleeing domestic violence, you don't necessarily want to be sharing a house with men, particularly those with backgrounds that you won't necessarily know, some people who are going to be still battling their own demons, whether that's drink, drugs, alcohol, whatever, who are wanting to progress on their journey. And so this whole risky mix, the concerns about the quality of the accommodation, the concerns about the appropriateness and the relevance of the support services that are being provided, or the adequacy of the support services being provided, was something that Thea and Professor Mullins were particularly concerned about. Birmingham City Council in particular were concerned about. And that's something that Commonweal are equally concerned about.
And so the conversations I have with landlords sometimes are, they'll say, oh yeah, but I've got this 4-bed house. I know I can get, I don't know, crazy numbers of rent per week because I'm doing it for supported accommodation. And they're generally talking about this exempt accommodation. Generally, when they're talking to me about it, they're like, I'll get a really long lease on my property. I'll get paid, I don't know, £200 a week for a really grotty little tiny room in a shared house in the back of the roughest bit of Birmingham, say, and they're like, it's brilliant. Look how much money I'm making each week. And that's where, from a landlord's point of view, the numbers look very, very appealing, don't they? People think, oh, that's great. That's the best way, definitely, to let my property. That's what I want. And I think that's what's brought a lot of landlords' interest into supported living, because they see those numbers and they think, oh, yeah, I want a bit of that. Thank you. The downside to it, as you're saying, is actually what that means for the people who are living in those properties, isn't it? And the impact that has.
Lisa, you're right. I'm smiling because the way that you're describing it, the way you're talking about it, the way your face is saying that this doesn't sound quite right, because it's not. No. It's you are factually absolutely correct, but it's not right. The concerns from Commonwealth's perspective, as I mentioned earlier, is the lack of governance and oversight in this area, and those people who have got into this space Now, whether that is private landlords, whether that is managing agents and sort of service providers and those taking leases off of individual private landlords, those people that are motivated purely by profit, purely by money, with less regard for the quality of the accommodation, the quality of the support, the quality of the services, the vulnerabilities of the people that they are housing. Quite frankly, the current system as it stands at the moment is enabling those people that are in it for the wrong reasons and the wrong motivations to this is a phrase which I don't want to use too often, but to exploit the system. Yeah. The exempt accommodation exemption was brought in 1996, specifically with the best of intentions, recognizing that there was a shortage of housing, specialist housing, even back in the day. And if you are going to provide housing for those that do require a degree of support, then that costs, and this was a way for the government at the time to reflect that and to make sure that those providing those services could have their reasonable costs reimbursed. And that as a reason for its existence is absolutely right and still persists today. If you're going to house people that are still working their way out of institutionalization from the prison system, or are fleeing domestic violence, or are getting used to accommodation after many years of sleeping on the streets or in hostels, they do have an element of support needs. Higher management, intensive housing management. And so it's right that that is covered, but that shouldn't be to the extent that is being exploited now by some who are doing this for the wrong reasons. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the additional costs are meant to cover the support to the individuals, the intensive housing management, the fact that actually you probably do want to be visiting your accommodation a couple of times a week because sometimes the people there may have issues, may have difficulties, may not always know how to do day-to-day maintenance or identify problems in the house. So you legitimately want to keep an eye on it. That's what the additional exemption, the higher levels, should be going to. It should not be being siphoned off in high levels of rent, is Commonweal's view. If you are a landlord of bricks and mortar, those bricks and mortar have a market value, which rightly or wrongly is dictated by normal market rent levels or by local housing allowance levels if you're using accommodating those that are in receipt of benefits, or universal credit levels or whatever. And you're quite right to say that in some cases, whether it's Birmingham, whether it's Hull, whether it's Bristol, whether it's parts of London, where the local housing allowance rate, the perceived market rent for a room in a shared house is 60, 70, 80 pounds a week. But the exempt accommodation means that you can charge 150, 200, 250 plus per week for that one single room, particularly if it's got all the attributes that you described earlier. If that is just being siphoned off to the private landlord in extreme rent levels, then that is the system not doing what it is meant to do. That difference between £80 a week and 250 quid a week should, in theory, the vast majority of that should be used to provide high quality support and services to the vulnerable people who are living in that accommodation. It shouldn't be siphoned off to give double-digit rates of return and yields to private landlords who otherwise would only be able to get 60, 70 pounds a week for their room.
I'm just going to draw the blind. The sun suddenly comes streaming in my window.
You're very lucky it's not sunny here.
And I think the thing is, it's about it being a fair system for everybody, isn't it? And I think there is recognition in a lot of society that LHA rates actually aren't high enough in a lot of areas for landlords, and so you can see where actually landlords are taking potentially a slightly higher risk in taking these tenants on. You know, they maybe do need to provide a property that's slightly more highly adapted, or so there needs to be some recognition. And I think it's around sitting at the rents that maybe at market rent, around kind of where it's fair, because LHA rents sometimes fall quite a long way short, don't they? But I think it's about landlords and property investors looking at the bigger picture, isn't it, from what you're saying? And actually, yeah, it looks lovely to you, those high level numbers, you're getting these big numbers into your pocket, super, but actually, what does that mean? Where's that money coming from? And at what cost is that money being paid to you? I think is what you're saying, isn't
it? It absolutely is. You know, I'm sure that there are people, I've watched a number of these podcasts now, Lisa, and I'm sure that the people that are watching this and that are interested in this want to do this for the right reasons. That certainly has been a theme of a number of your podcasts, and that's right. And what I want to say, and the theme that Commonweal is very much pushing, is that the exempt accommodation system, the principle of it, is still there and is still required. And what we're looking to do is reform, not abolish the system, because that's not going to help anybody, not least of which the tens of thousands of vulnerable individuals who are housed in this form of accommodation up and down the country. They're in this accommodation because they need somewhere to live. What we want, and what I hope you and everyone watching this podcast want, is that they have access to the right accommodation with the right support and the right services to help them move and transition in their lives. And certainly from Commonwealth's perspective, so it's not about abolition, it is about reforming the system. We're an independent charity. We are absolutely not a vested interest in this space. We're not an exempt accommodation service provider. We're not an exempt accommodation property provider. We will identify issues of concern. We want to hear the points of view from everybody that's involved in this. And hopefully we can use our independent voice to try and encourage, embarrass, cajole those parties that do have a role to play to move things forward. And certainly the fantastic work of Thea Reisbeck, from the University of Birmingham, in highlighting this, and her research has been sort of groundbreaking and really has helped to raise the issues. We talked earlier that there's a governance and oversight deficit in this whole area. It falls between too many stools, and that's been part of the problem, particularly in the non-commissioned area. So this is not where it's being commissioned by a local authority or a public body of some sort. Again, I've seen a number of your previous podcasts, Lisa, where you've talked about work, or you've talked to landlords and investors who are providing accommodation for local authorities for homelessness, temporary accommodation. Now, I don't know the specifics of those arrangements, but one would hope that's being commissioned by a local authority that says we need 100 additional properties, 1,000 additional properties, whatever it is. And this is the specification that we expect. This is the level of the quality of accommodation we expect. This is the service we expect you to provide to these individuals. And so whether they do it or not, and I will always hope that they would, there is a level of governance there. There is somebody is keeping an eye on whether or not the quality is right, the services are right, and that there is a fair price being paid. Non-commission end of the spectrum, which is the bit that we talked about and Thea focused on in her work in Birmingham, is where that isn't being supported. It's not being commissioned by local authorities or public bodies, probation service or social services or anybody else. It is literally individual landlords, providers, operators recognizing that there's a gap in the market, that there's not enough accommodation, and jumping onto that bandwagon. And I suppose the word of warning I would give to private landlords and investors looking at this space is that bandwagon is not going to continue rolling in the same way for too much longer. I hope it's not anyway, because I think enough people are now aware that there is the ability for exploitation and actually that reform is needed. And whilst some people may have been very lucky and have made hay while the sun shone, I don't think that is going to continue for long term into the future. The need for the accommodation will still be there. And hopefully a reformed system will mean that a fair level of return could still be expected, whether that's, as you said, for the private landlords who are taking a degree of risk. So I don't think anyone is saying that landlords should just get sort of normal rent levels if they are willing to house people that others wouldn't necessarily choose to house. But that should be a reasonable and fair additional cost.
Absolutely.
And certainly those that are providing support and services to the vulnerable individuals need to be absolutely clear what they're providing and how much it's costing them. And the system should therefore reimburse them for that. That's what the system should be there for.
Absolutely. For those landlords who are looking to let properties to providers in this sector, what do you think they should be looking out for? Have you got any advice for them about what they should be doing?
Ask the questions. Ask very clear questions about who you're housing. Is this under some sort of contractual relationship or commissioned basis with a local authority? Certainly be very clear on what the service standards are that they are operating to. And some of the poorer examples where this is that have been identified in the recent research are where almost all of the sort of the property management, the property maintenance, and to some extent the service provision is being passed back to the individual private landlords. And most private landlords don't want to be necessarily managing the property management, the property management or maintenance, and certainly don't have the skills, the knowledge, the expertise on how best to deal with women fleeing domestic violence, those leaving the prison estate, those coming off of the streets from rough sleeping or whatever. That should be being done by experts in the field, operating best practice support models, and making sure that the appropriate mix of people are in the housing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes landlords might look at the numbers that the providers are getting and think, oh, actually, they're getting a lot more money per week. I'll do that. I'll take on the care provision or support provision. And as you say, it's very specialist, isn't it? Some of these people have got very complex needs, so
absolutely. And, perish the thought, but sometimes things go wrong. And if you are in the nicest possible word, amateur, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, you don't want that happening to you. And there have been some terrible examples of things that have gone wrong in some of these properties. Not all of them. And I think that's the point that Commonweal equally want to make. This is not saying that everyone operating non-commissioned exempt accommodation is gaming the system or exploiting the system or not providing the support and services. A vast majority of them are or want to. But as I said earlier, sadly, the limited oversight, the limited governance arrangements that are in place means that those that want to game the system, those that want to exploit it, are sadly able to with a high degree of impunity at the moment. Now, Commonweal are delighted that our conversations with the likes of the Regulator for Social Housing, with the Ministry, Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, I think that's what they are this week, and we're continuing to have conversations with the DWP, is starting to bear fruit, and those organisations in particular are starting to take this. I'm sure they always have taken it seriously, but are starting to put a little bit more public effort into addressing some of the concerns, and we're very excited excited, maybe the wrong word, interested going forward to see how the regulator for social housing really do use the new powers that they're going to get in terms of consumer standards, and making sure that they can proactively intervene and oversee and regulate how housing associations are delivering those consumer standards. Because that's one of the things that I failed to mention earlier, and apologies for that, Lisa. Too many of the way that the system has been set up, if the ultimate housing benefit claim, if the ultimate claim going into the local authority is in the name of a registered provider, a housing association, then if that local authority agrees that rent level, it's at no cost to them. If it's a housing association's name, that local authority will receive 100% of that subsidy back from the DWP. So again, there's no real incentive for hard-pressed, overworked local authority officers to necessarily waste too much time and effort on that. Now, again, I don't want that to sound like that's a description of all local authority housing benefit officers, because it's not, and there are many that do take this very seriously and do see it as a waste of public money, whether that's local authority or central government, makes no difference. So there have been, over the last sort of 10, 15 years or so, this proliferation or this exponential growth from these umbrella lease-based housing associations who own very little accommodation themselves, act as this umbrella under which a number of lease models are put in place with private landlords either directly leasing property to them or leasing them to an agent who in turn then leases them on to one of these umbrella housing associations. And certainly the regulator for social housing has been looking very, very closely at a number of these. A number of them are the majority in terms of the operators in Birmingham, in terms of the quantity of accommodation that they manage, are in some sort of regulatory regime, either facing sort of regulatory downgrades or being deemed to be non-compliant. So things are going to have to change for those organizations. And again, it's that lack of regulatory oversight. The boards of those housing associations are the ones who are liable for making sure that the quality of the accommodation, the quality of the support, the value for money of the rents that they are charging are correct and as they should be for a registered provider. And too often, as the regulator for social housing is finding recently, that is not the case, and therefore they are in breach of their regulations. And so to answer your question earlier, what should private landlords do? Ask questions, be very clear what's going on, try and gauge where the tenants themselves are likely to be coming from. Are they being referred by an organisation, a local authority, a public body? Certainly be very clear what the support costs or what support is being provided, or traditional services are being provided to those individuals. And certainly if I were them, I would also be asking, how do people move on from my accommodation? And at the risk of muddying the waters, that's another major social injustice that Commonweal are very concerned about. This form of accommodation should be transitional. Somebody coming out of prison absolutely does need a little bit of additional support, a little bit of additional services whilst they get their head around what this means for them, whilst they get back into employment, whilst they sort themselves out, whilst they identify what their longer term housing options might be. So there's a spike in support when they come out, and that should drop down over a period of time. Ultimately, to the extent where they don't need that support and either are able to move on to mainstream accommodation, if mainstream accommodation is available, or the provider should reduce the amount of support they're providing to that individual and reflect that in the housing benefit claim. Now, if you're operator and you're receiving 250 quid a week for that person, by defining that person as having needs and support, your business model is going to be quite unwilling to define them in any other way and to say that actually, no, this person doesn't need my support anymore. They are, my words, not ours, they're better. They can handle life's ups and downs as well as anybody else. Because as soon as you do that, then your justification for charging 250 quid a week for that person disappears. Or if they move out, your balance sheet, your sort of management accounts are showing a vacancy and a void loss of 250 quid a week as opposed to 60 quid a week. So one of the concerns that we've got in Commonweal, and I think Thea highlighted this in her report, is people are being trapped in that definition of high support, and they shouldn't be. And that really worries me. There's been a movement across support services of advantage thinking, which is defining people by what they can do, what their ambitions are, where they want to go, not constantly defining people by their deficits, what they might have been before, what their history may have been. That doesn't mean anything.
No,
That's not. And if you constantly define people by what they can't do, then that is really damaging for them long term, and it's damaging for society long term.
And so it's looking at that, understanding those move on, what happens when people have finished having the support from. So that's the question to be asking, isn't it, about what's that transition and how does that work going forward?
And let's be honest, that is a problem because there ain't enough housing. At the end of the day, this is a bubble that has been created and exploited by those that have wanted to do such a thing, because demand for accommodation hugely outstrips supply. So what is absolutely needed, and this is at the root of Commonweal's issues, but also with the likes of Crisis, the homelessness campaigning charity, that have latterly latched on to this as an area of concern and are using their platform and their megaphone to raise the concern as well. Ultimately, this is about lack of supply, and we need more affordable housing, we need more social housing, we need more private sector rented housing, we need more owner-occupied housing to meet the sort of as broad a range of needs as possible. And certainly we may need more accommodation that is available for those people that do have some low-level ongoing support needs or additional service needs, because there will be a number of people listening to this podcast, no doubt, who will be sort of tearing their hair out saying that the housing benefit system, the exempt accommodation, isn't there to provide support. It's not there to cover support or care services. It's intensive housing management.
Absolutely. Ashley, we'll put in the show notes how to contact Commonweal and to access some of the reports and stuff that you talked about within this. We could talk all day. There's so much we could cover, but thank you for joining me today, Ashley. It's been great chatting to you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting, Lisa. Thanks, Lisa.